I don't want people to hear me or us saying that anytime someone is offended, that it's a paper tiger, because that's not true. There are legitimate situations where people have experienced legitimate trauma. To do something that calls that trauma to the forefront and creates a legitimate mental, emotional, physiological reaction is very unfortunate and something that should be avoided at all cost. If you know that it's coming and you can tell somebody about it, then great. Then they can avoid that. And if there's something in a course description that lets somebody know, hey, we're going to cover a book in here that deals with rape or molestation or home invasion or something that hits really close to home, then by all means,
Opt out.
give the person the opportunity to say, I want to avoid that. And if someone is in a situation where they have been traumatized in a legitimate way, and we can provide a healing, nurturing, safe environment for them, we should do that in the educational environment. But there has to be some kind of threshold. If you're so hypersensitive, so fragile that virtually anything a professor says, they're so paranoid that somebody in the class is going to be headed over to the dean's office after class by something they said in an approved curriculum, and it's going to get traction, then we've got the tail wagging the dog. And I don't think we're preparing the student for life. So what do we do about it? What's the solution?
Well, I think it's important to, like you said, be sensitive to students who are struggling with certain things that could be trigger, triggering to them. I mean, that's why we have counseling centers. That's why we have people that students can talk to if they're struggling with certain issues. But I think preparing them in the way that we need to with the trigger warning should be something, like I said earlier, that's universally talked about in terms of what that is. It can't just be student driven. I think there should be more guidelines put in place as to what that looks like, just like parental guidance warnings on TV shows and things like that. I think if we just let this kind of be student driven, we're going to be in trouble.
I think so. It seems to me that universities were designed to bring together different ideologies. And if you look at the Socratic method, you had to examine your own undocumented beliefs. Okay, let's challenge these. Let me hear the other side. I was born and raised in the Baptist church. I didn't stay in the Baptist church my whole life, but I was born and raised in the Baptist church. And I recall one time I was reading a book about Satan, and I read a lot when I was young. The pastor saw me reading the book about Satan, and oh my God, they called my parents. They visited the home that night. They wanted to know what was going on. And I said, well, you're talking about it all the time. I thought this is the enemy. Study the enemy. I grew up as an athlete. I studied the opponent all the time. If this is the enemy, I wanted to. No, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't. Why not? You talk about how Satan will sneak up on you. You're not going to sneak up on me. I'm going to know what this sumbitch has on his mind every minute. I was stunned that this pastor did not want me reading about Satan. I really was. It's like, it wasn't a pro Satan book. It was a negative Satan. It was about, here's all the tricks and traps and all that kind of stuff. And
So the Dr. Phil personality has not changed over time.
apparently not. To my parents' credit, they said, "Yeah, well, thanks for stopping by, but you're not censoring what the boy's reading. At least it's not a comic book."
But see, you just mentioned something that's so critical, which is the parental influence in addition to the school, right? So that is so important. So if we're going to teach our kids that to do this in this way, it's got to start with the parents, I think. And it starts at that young age where we're teaching them everybody's a winner. You get a trophy for everything. If you're offended, I'll call the school and get that teacher fired. I mean, that's what we're dealing with now, as opposed to, hey, you need to learn how to deal with this.
It seems to me the first step that I would have advocated in some of these situations is if the student came in and said, "I found this to be offensive," then make your case. And clearly, if it's blatant bigotry, if there's some, it doesn't have to be racial, whatever it might be, then look at it. If it's a pattern of behavior, then you deal with it. If it's not, then you try to have the two resolve their differences. Is this your intention? Figure it out. Hopefully, the two can resolve the situation. That's part of the maturity of the student having a difference. Now, understand there's a difference in power between the student and if they're making an anonymous complaint and they don't want to face the teacher and fear for their grade or whatever. I understand that. But to the extent that the student can resolve these things themselves, they need to do that. They need to own that. If it's a situation where there's a power imbalance, I get it, but they need to be held accountable for what's the real issue. You just can't put something in the complaint box and walk away. You've got to stand for the complaint. You got to give a rationale for it. And there's got to be more to it than just, I was offended, Bob student.
And you may or may not get your way as a result. I mean, it might not go your way, and then you have to deal with that.
As I've said, if it's a legitimate thing, then certainly accommodations can be made, but we need to prepare these students for the real world. Psychology says they need to be tough enough to learn to cope with and accommodate to things in life that they're not going to like. They're not going to like everything. Everybody's not going to get a trophy. And that's not going to make everybody happy, but
They're not happy anyway.
they're not happy anyway.
Yeah.
Now, is there a point that you believe we should start teaching these kids how to cope with anxiety, depression, stress, cyberbullying, these issues as part of the curriculum in school?
Definitely. I mean, I think, cognitive behavioral therapy, even though I practice from an eclectic, point of view, I believe that cognitive behavioral therapy is the most researched therapy. It's probably the easiest to understand and to put into practice because it's very, systematic in terms of how it works. But to change your thinking about something and not just act on your feeling, but to actually check it, make sure that it's not distorted in some way, hear what some other, possibilities are, and start to really look at, is this just me and the way that I feel? Is this something that, like you said, is something that needs to be pursued and dealt with? And I think that we just need to teach our children how to gain skills to cope with adversity, prejudice, bullying, all of these things, being offended, and that it doesn't make it right, but it teaches them how to cope with it, whether that's making the complaint or whether that's dealing with it, onto themselves or whether it's addressing it or whatever it is. I think to give them some skills other than just call somebody out on social media and try to get them canceled.